My name is Michael Harden. I grew up here in Maryland. I am a CrossFit trainer, a fitness trainer here. I own a gym near Baltimore. I have been a believer my whole life, as long as I can remember. But I really began taking my relationship with the Lord seriously when I was about 11 years old. And I really began pursuing Him on my own. For me, it became, I always grew up in church, so I always had the fellowship and I always had the experiences, but I didn't pursue Him, and I didn't pursue our relationship on my own during the week until I was about 11 or 12. And I would do Bible studies with my friends and learn everything I could about the Lord and apply what I learned to my life and actually really be praying and actually really be living for Him and putting the Lord first and making Him the highest priority in my life until then. For me, with the supernatural, the experiences started when I was very young. I've always been able to see things, and I've always had dreams that have come true. So typically when I was younger, it started with seeing angels, seeing demons, and just being able to sense spiritual darkness or warmth or light from people. So I've always had the ability to, not 100% of the time, but when the Lord decided to show me, I could see truth very clearly. I would see angels or see light around people who loved the Lord and people who were pursuing Him, and I could feel darkness or feel cold around people who were not with Him and not loving Him. And so from the time I was young, I remember my parents told me I would ask if they could see the things that I was seeing, and I thought that everyone could see these things, but I didn't understand that it was at the time just me. And I remember some occasions feeling cold, feeling the darkness coming from someone before I walked into a room with them. And then when I would walk in, I've had people run away from me as a child. I'd walk in a room and I'd see someone look at me. I'd feel this cold from them, and then they would turn and run away from me, an adult. And I was, 7, 8 years old. And I didn't fully understand at the time. I just understood that there was a darkness there and that they weren't comfortable being in the presence that I was in. And so that was very interesting as a child, trying to understand what was happening. So I've had that happen multiple times. And just typically nowadays for me, I'll have dreams that come true or I'll have experiences like that, but usually it is when someone speaks or when someone speaks from the Bible or teaches, I feel like I can feel a light or I can feel a cold, whether it's true or not, or whether it aligns with what Scripture says. And so for me, just discerning that difference has always come very easily. My wife says that it's more that I see to the root of things very easily, and I see things very simply that I think would otherwise be confusing, that the Lord just decides to show me what's really going on in a situation or what's really going on behind someone's motivations. It's interesting because for me, the supernatural experiences, since they've been going on my whole life, they tend to not stand out as much. They tend to not seem so drastic or so dramatic. The things that stand out to me are the gifts that are not as supernatural, but that have a large impact. So there are many things so for my business, I was called to open a gym, and the first few years, it was many, many, many hours a week of work and very few hours of sleep. And I know there is no way I would have been able to manage to continue that if it were not for the Lord helping me through it and for keeping me alive and keeping me healthy. Sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night for 15 months. There's no way I would have been able to do that. And so I think the gifts that he's given me have been more the more drastic experiences are the less supernatural ones, giving me a drive and a discipline and maybe a holy stubbornness to not quit when things don't seem like they make sense, to not give up when things seem like they're not going to turn out. And I feel like he just has given me this confidence in what he calls me to, that I am very, very slow to abandon what I feel like he's called me to do. And so that might not be as supernatural, but in my mind it is, because I would not be able to stick to these things when everyone tells me I should stop, or everyone tells me that it's not going to work. And I've had that happen many times with even when I met my wife, I had everyone tell me there's no way this will work out. We had some difficulty early on, and essentially no one believed that we would be able to get married, and that it would be impossible. And so many people told me that it would be impossible. But it was one of those things that once the Lord told me it was going to happen, I just stuck with it. And it might be years before everything turns out, but though that might not seem supernatural, those have been the most drastic and influential and impactful gifts in my life. For someone who is trying to find their place and their way to use the gifting that they're realizing the Lord's given them, my advice would be two things. One, to seek Him first. And I think that having our eyes on the Lord tends to put everything else in perspective. I've found that a lot of times there's confusion with gifting when our eyes are on the gifting. And I think that the easiest solution is to have our eyes on the Lord, to pursue Him, pursue glorifying Him, and the opportunities to use the gifting will present themselves. And I think the manifestation of the gifting presents itself. I think that a lot of confusion and even frustration can come from having so much attention on the gifting itself. And I think having our attention on the Lord, having our worship be directed toward Him, having our attention and our focus be directed toward Him, all the gifting tends to work itself out. All of the ministry tends to work itself out, and the confusion tends to disappear. Oh, that is an interesting question. Wow. I don't know if I could say. Sometimes I've just seen a presence. Sometimes I just see, it's like fire, like a pillar of fire. It's interesting because we know there's different kinds of spiritual beings and there's different things. And so, oh man, that is an interesting question. It is. To be honest, I've seen more demonic stuff than I have seen angelic, to which that I could probably describe a little bit more clearly, but the angelic tends to be more of a feeling. While I might see something, it tends to be more of a feeling. The demonic tends to be more visual. And where I might see fire that doesn't produce light, that just looks like it's made of shadows, so I wouldn't know how to describe that, but I've seen buildings and fires and buildings and rooms that looked like they were on fire, but the flames were black instead of orange, or producing darkness instead of producing light. So I've seen figures made of that. I've seen figures in robes where you couldn't see faces, just darkness or light. And so sometimes it's different every time, and sometimes it's just the presence itself. That is an interesting question. I pray. Usually it's what I've found is, for me, I think when the Lord shows me things, it's the majority of the time is to call my attention to something. And it's either as a reminder of what's really going on kind of behind the scenes, or you could say in the supernatural, where so little of what we see physically is the whole picture. It's such a fraction of what's really going on. And so often when things are revealed, it's more as a reminder of, hey, the majority of what's going on here is not happening physically, and the influence and the impact of things happening aren't quite as simple or as random as they seem. And the other is just to reveal things to me to pray for. I feel like sometimes there are people who I've been called to pray for, and the way that the Lord shows me that, hey, you need to go pray for this person, is I'll see the demonic presence attacking them or holding on to them or whatever. And so it gives me an opportunity to think, okay, this is someone who really needs me to step in and pray for them or to talk with them. And so in these circumstances, I believe it's different every time. I think that I pray. This is something I continue to learn, but it's interesting to pray to a God who is sovereign and glorious and deserving of worship, and also who is a friend and a counselor and a brother. And so I pray with as much reverence as I can, while also praying with as much close brotherly relation as I can. And so I try to approach the Lord with confidence and boldness, but also with reverence. And it tends to be a conversation as I would have if he was standing right next to me, just conversationally. And but with the aspect of reverence and deference, and with respect to his will, more than just I would tell my actual brother, hey, go do this for me, you know. So it tends to be a reverent but familial conversation. That changes. I love 1st and 2nd Peter. I feel like it's the whole Bible packed into just Peter's letters, and so I love 1st and 2nd Peter. I go over them many times, and I love the density of it. I think there's such wisdom, and it covers so much that I'll go through and I'll spend a month reading the first few chapters, and just little bits at a time, finding as much information as I can out of it, and learning as much as I can about the Lord from it. I think that there's different levels of methods to read Scripture, and I think primarily is just what does it say? Just going back to what is it actually saying word for word. And then I think Christians tend to take a step further, and they say, okay, what does it say now? How do I apply it to my life? And so what does it say, and how does it apply to me? And then I think for me the most beneficial has been, and I would think the most mature approach would be, what does it say, but what is it telling me about the Lord's character? What is it telling me about who he is? And how does it affect my worship of him? And how does it affect my ability to see how glorious he is?